My friends, there are moments in history when silence is no longer an option, when dignity demands a voice, and the truth demands to be spoken. This is one of those moments. At dawn, without warning or justification, the United States struck deep into the sovereign territory of Burkina Faso. Precision bombs fell on Yatena province, not against terrorists, not against rebels, but against a nation charting its own course, refusing to be subdued. Make no mistake, this was not a mistake. It was a message for every African nation seeking to rise without permission. But instead of fear, something else is rising. Defiance, unity. A roar from the ground, our country, our rights, our future. Stay with us, because this is not just another story. It is the future our ancestors dreamed of. Sign up and join us for an Africa without bows. Before the sun rose, before the markets opened or the children stirred, the silence of northern Burkina Faso was broken, not by birdsong or morning prayer, but by thunder from the sky. At precisely 5:42 a.m. local time, 2 missiles struck a remote military outpost in Yatena province. The earth shook. A tower crumbled. 3 lives, 2 soldiers and 1 civilian, were lost. 7 others lay wounded beneath dust and rubble. But what truly shattered that morning was not a building. It was the belief that African sovereignty meant something to the world. The missiles came not from terrorists or rebel militias. They came from a forward U.S. military base in Niger, 380 miles away, launched without permission, consultation, or warning. Burkina Faso's Ministry of Defense was clear. This was not a joint mission. It was not a defensive act. It was an unprovoked unilateral strike, a violation of the UN Charter and of a nation's dignity. President Ibrahim Traoré responded not with panic, but with power. He appeared on live television, eyes steady, voice unwavering. This strike was not merely against our land, he declared. It was against our right to exist as a free and independent people. Within hours, Burkina Faso's 12,000 active duty troops were placed on alert. Border defenses surged. Strategic bases like Koudougou and Ouagadougou rose to DEFCON 2. The capital braced not for surrender, but for resistance. But the real battle cry came not from the barracks, but from the people. That evening, over 35,000 citizens flooded Revolution Square. Men, women, elders, children. Some came barefoot, some carried flags. All came with purpose. And from their lips rose a chant that echoed across the Sahel. Our land, our right, our future. It wasn't just a protest. It was a reckoning. Within hours, social media across West Africa lit up with that phrase. Radios in Dakar played it. Callers in Lagos repeated it. Something had cracked, and something older had awakened. This was not fear. It was the sound of a continent remembering itself. The missiles may have struck Burkina Faso, but the shockwaves rippled across a continent that refused to remain silent. Within just 18 hours, the African Union convened an emergency virtual summit, one of the swiftest responses in its history. Delegates from 42 African nations joined the call. Some spoke from palaces, others from modest offices. But their message was united. This was not just an attack on Burkina Faso. This was an attack on us all. President Ibrahim Traoré joined by video. His image beamed onto a giant screen in Addis Ababa. His voice was calm, but unyielding. If the sovereignty of one African nation can be violated without consequence, he said, then no African nation is truly free. His words hit like thunder. Across the continent, governments scrambled to respond. Mali's leadership condemned the strike as a colonial shadow returning in daylight. Guinea called it an act of war against African dignity. Even countries traditionally aligned with the West, Senegal, Ghana, issued cautious but firm calls for U.S. accountability and African unity. But it wasn't just presidents and diplomats who rose. It was the people. In Bamako, tens of thousands marched down Independence Avenue, waving not just Malian flags, but the red, green, gold of Burkina Faso. In Conakry, vigils lit the night sky outside the Burkina Faso embassy. Mothers prayed, elders cried, youth vowed never to forget. Even in cities where Western ties run deep, like Nairobi and Kigali, voices of protest rang out. Small, yes, but clear, and growing. On social media, the words from Revolution Square, our land, our right, our future, became a Pan-African mantra shared in Swahili, Wolof, Yoruba, and English, repeated by students, taxi drivers, radio hosts, and preachers. In Lagos, a talk show caller said, "If they can strike Burkina today, they can strike Nigeria tomorrow. This is not security. This is domination with a new face." And from the diaspora, from London, Paris, Atlanta, came echoes of support. In Harlem, murals of Traoré began appearing on walls beside Malcolm and Mandela. In Marseille, African students raised fists beneath the slogan, "No more silent invasions." This wasn't just solidarity. This was a spark, a moment when the continent, often divided by politics and language, found one voice. A voice not asking for permission, but declaring, Africa is awake. In Washington, the fallout was immediate, and the damage control swift. Within 24 hours of the strike, Pentagon officials stood behind podiums, reading from carefully crafted statements. They insisted the operation was a targeted anti-terror action. They claimed credible intelligence had identified an imminent threat to U.S. assets in the Sahel. But when reporters pressed for details, names, coordinates, photographic proof, none were offered. For the African public, it was déjà vu. Security threat, they said. Preemptive strike, they claimed. But whose security? Whose permission? At the United Nations, Burkina Faso's ambassador called for an emergency Security Council meeting. The room grew tense. U.S. diplomats repeated their justification, but Russia and China were having none of it, condemning the strike as a blatant violation of the UN Charter. Even France, though careful with its words, called for de-escalation and respect for sovereignty. Outside those chambers, media narratives began to split. Western outlets, CNN, Fox News, BBC, focused heavily on the alleged terror threat. Coverage lingered on instability in the Sahel, extremist groups, the difficult choices of U.S. foreign policy. But African news channels told a different story. They showed the ruins of the Yatena outpost, interviews with survivors, tearful relatives, footage of Captain Ibrahim Traoré's powerful speech broadcast on repeat. We do not ask for conflict, but we will not be walked upon. The contrast was stark. On Western screens, Burkina Faso was a problem. On African screens, it was a symbol. In cities like London and Paris, diaspora communities organized flash protests. Banners read, "Neo-colonialism is not counterterrorism. Africa deserves respect, not missiles." In Harlem, Chicago, Oakland, places where the heartbeat of Black America still echoes the legacy of civil rights, Pan-African groups rallied. Elders spoke of Patrice Lumumba, of Sankara, of Gaddafi. Young voices asked, is this how they silence us now? Even within the United States, voices of dissent grew louder. Senator Mark Rutledge of Illinois warned, If we are conducting military operations in sovereign nations without consultation, we are not just undermining democracy abroad, we are staining it at home. Meanwhile, on social media, a tidal wave rose. Analysts and influencers across Africa accused global newsrooms of framing the story to protect Western interests. Threads went viral showing a timeline of U.S. military interventions across the continent, Libya, Somalia, now Burkina Faso, and in the comments below, a fire burned. If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say Amen in the comments below. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't blink. While foreign embassies held emergency meetings and media spun half-truths, he got to work. What followed was not a flurry of anger, but a sequence of deliberate, calculated moves, each one sending a clear message. Burkina Faso would not be bullied. First came the military recalibration. Within 72 hours of the strike, Traoré convened high-level meetings with defense officials from Niger and Mali. These weren't photo ops. They were war councils. The three nations, each led by young, defiant military leaders, signed a historic pact in Bamako, a mutual defense agreement. Its name, the Alliance of Sahel States, AES. An attack on one is an attack on all. The joint statement read, "This wasn't mere symbolism. The pact promised a 5,000-strong rapid reaction force, African soldiers, trained by Africans, commanded by Africans." Next, Traoré turned east. While Western diplomats threatened aid cuts and sanctions, Burkina Faso welcomed new guests, Russian military advisors from the newly formed Africa Corps. These weren't mercenaries hidden in shadows. They were uniformed, visible, operating with government consent. A new base was quickly set up near Lumbila, just northeast of Ouagadougou. The optics were unmistakable. Where the West sought obedience, the East offered partnership. But Traoré didn't stop at guns and uniforms. He turned inward, to the very soil of his country. For decades, foreign mining corporations had extracted Burkina Faso's gold and manganese, reaping billions while leaving crumbs. That era ended. With the stroke of a pen, Traoré's administration launched a sweeping review of all mining contracts. Those that didn't prioritize national interest were suspended. "Our land is not for sale. Our resources are not a gift," he declared. His policies hit nerves. France froze development funds. The EU issued warnings, but Traoré had already pivoted. Deals with Turkey, Iran, and China filled the gaps. Fuel shipments resumed. Rice and grain imports stabilized. The predicted economic collapse never came. Instead, national pride soared. In schools, students began morning recitations with "Burkina Faso belongs to its people." On the streets, murals of Traoré appeared, camouflage jacket, beret tilted, fist raised, and on state television, he said quietly, "Sovereignty is not a gift. It is a responsibility." The world saw a young captain with limited resources, but Africa saw something else, a leader who would not bend, a nation refusing to kneel, and for the first time in a long time, the winds in West Africa shifted. From the ashes of the strike, a new order began to form. In a joint press conference held under the blazing Sahel sun, 3 flags stood side by side: Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Behind them, 3 leaders spoke not as isolated presidents, but as brothers in arms. The Alliance of Sahel States, AES, was no longer a vision. It was a living pact. "We will no longer wait for others to protect us," declared Colonel Abdourahmane Chiani of Niger. "We will protect ourselves." The AES wasn't just military, it was political, economic, and spiritual. A break from dependency, a declaration of dignity. Among its key pillars, a joint rapid reaction force of 5,000 soldiers stationed along shared borders, shared biometric ID systems to control migration and cross-border crime, a harmonized customs policy, a 0.5% solidarity tax to fund African-built infrastructure, plans for a unified Sahelian passport, free movement between member states. For the first time, African nations were drawing new maps, not based on colonial borders, but on shared struggle and shared future. Burkina Faso latest news circulated fast. Military drills held in Ouagadougou. New air surveillance towers installed near Dori and Fada Ngorma. AES forces patrolled jointly in convoys bearing all three flags. The message was clear. Any future strike would not meet one nation, but a wall of resistance. But the transformation didn't stop at borders. In Algeria, a quiet summit brought together representatives from Chad, Guinea, and Central African Republic. On the table, the expansion of AES into a broader Pan-African Security Compact. No longer would African states beg for UN, peacekeepers, or NATO trainers. The future would be homegrown, and where weapons were once imported, now came factories, small-scale arms production initiatives with technical guidance from Iran and logistical support from Russia. Critics in Brussels and Washington labeled it dangerous isolationism, but to African citizens, it felt like justice delayed, finally arriving. Even more powerful than policy were the symbols. A new AES flag was unveiled, 3 stars encircling the baobab tree, rooted deep, rising high. In Ouagadougou, school children painted it on their notebooks. In Niamey, it was draped from balconies. In Bamako, it flew beside portraits of Sankara, Nkrumah, and Lumumba. And in the whispers of the markets, in the sermons of churches, in the rhythm of djembe drums, one phrase kept returning: Africa is finally standing. Traoré, once seen as too young, too bold, now stood at the heart of a movement larger than himself, one not built on slogans, but on courage, clarity, and coordination. The ground had shifted. The line had been drawn. The dust may have settled in Yatena, but the fire it lit has only just begun to burn. The strike meant to silence a sovereign nation instead sparked a continental chorus. It brought together generals and farmers, presidents and poets, youth and elders. From the gold mines of Burkina Faso to the marketplaces of Bamako, from churches in Ghana to barber shops in Harlem, one truth was spoken again and again: Africa's sovereignty is not negotiable. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, once a soldier, now a statesman, became more than the face of a nation. He became the embodiment of a question we've asked for generations. Can Africa stand, not as the servant of empires, but as the architect of its own destiny? He didn't answer with speeches alone. He answered with decisions, with alliances, with laws, with strength. But this is not just his fight. This is the fight of every African voice silenced by foreign power. Every village bombed in the name of security, every resource taken, every history erased, every dream deferred. And now, that tide is turning. Across the continent, leaders are rethinking their place in the world. People are reimagining what justice looks like when it's no longer imported. The future is being spoken aloud in Swahili, in Hausa, in Dioula, in Wolof, and yes, in English, French, and Portuguese too. It is being sung in drum circles and written in protest signs. It is being prayed over in mosques and debated in classrooms. And maybe, just maybe, the ancestors who once walked shackled now watch their descendants walk upright. So we ask you, could a new union, like the Sahel Shield, grow into a continental force? Could other nations follow Traoré's footsteps? Could this be the beginning of something greater than borders? If you believe it can, leave a comment. Africa rise. And if this story moved something in your chest, don't scroll past. Like, share, speak, subscribe, because they hid our history long enough. Let's speak our future out loud. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story, the kind they still don't want you to hear.